This meeting is being recorded.
There's no, I don't know if anyone else has lost the audio here.
I think I just asked Kristen because I couldn't hear. I think they dropped off.
It would seem that way.
Yeah, probably talking about us.
Were they all in town hall?
Yeah, were they all in one of those?
They were in the
rooms?
regular, I think they were in the regular room, but I don't think Sue's there tonight. So I think they're
Oh,
trying
that's
to
right.
figure out how to work everything.
I just sent them a text just to see if we can get back on. Rick, I guess we're not that important.
I think we already knew that though, John.
Yes, we did.
A little stressful as the secretary. What am I missing?
Right, they said they're coming back now. He's got a text from Tom.
There we go.
Hello. Okay, can everyone hear us? A nod, a thumbs up, or?
Yes.
Thank you, thank you. All right, so let us get back to the agenda. So the first agenda item is questions from the public on items that are not on the agenda. Do we have any questions from anybody on Zoom? All right, hearing none, we'll move to the next agenda item, which is the approval of minutes from the August 16th meeting. Tina, do you want to lead us through that?
Yes. I've been so focused on the August 23rd meeting notes. There were nominal changes to the 16th. I mean, nothing of any spirit whatsoever. They slid through.
Great. Does anyone have additional comments or edits?
Yeah, I'd like to suggest, if it isn't too much of a burden, that you, and I'm looking specifically on page, one is that the pages be numbered, but it's page 5, the capital project financing options. But I suggest that you add people's last names and maybe positions too, because in the next year or the year after, people won't recognize who Tom or Michelle or Rick or, you know.
Sure.
No offense.
I know that because when I started practicing law, I used to take notes of phone calls and just put the day and the month. It didn't take me long to discover that it doesn't start with a year in case it's lasted more than a few months.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll be happy to do that.
Other than that, I'm very happy with the minutes.
Thank you. Any additional comments? All right, I'll accept the motion.
Move to adopt the minutes of August 16th with the minor amendments referenced by Tina and myself.
All right, do you have a second? Second. Okay, roll call vote. Nancy.
Aye.
Tina.
Aye, sorry, aye.
Andy.
Aye.
Evelyn has not joined us. Okay. Kristen.
Aye.
Al. Caitlin.
Aye.
Sarah.
I was not present.
Okay. Kathy. Aye. Joe Griffin.
Aye.
Jason.
Aye.
And Carol.
Aye.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is Article C, the transfer of unassigned fund balance to new stabilization fund. It's a hearing and a discussion on that. So let me start by reading the article as it is presently proposed. So Article C says, will the town transfer an amount of money from available reserves into a capital project cost and debt service stabilization fund established hereby under Mass General Law, Chapter 40, Section 5, for the purpose of paying debt service payments for the excluded debt notes and or bonds to be issued for the new public safety facility and or the new Foster Elementary School, in order to reduce the need to raise these funds through the annual tax rate or for any other lawful purpose or act on anything related thereto. Caitlin, I understand that you are spearheading this evening, so would you like to take it away?
Yep. Yep. So thanks for the article is so. To reiterate, is to create the capital project costs and debt service Stabilization Fund, and transfer approximately 7 million into this fund for the purpose of paying down the debt service for the borrowing for Foster and the public safety facility. So Joe, Brendan and I worked on this article. We did send it out for review. I don't have put together just the table so you guys can kind of glance through the key points that we included in the article. So we can highlight them real quickly if that's helpful, or, you know, if people already have some additional comments that they want to discuss. We can look at that. Joe, do you want to?
Sure. You know, as Caitlin said, you know, we put together what we saw as a list of the key points, but if I back up a little bit, I know Brenda sent to everyone an iteration of our comment on this particular article last weekend before she left on vacation. And, you know, we did get back responses, and thank you to those who took the time to read them and provide editing and other comments to those, to the first iteration, if you will, of what we sent out. Is very, very helpful. And as I, you know, read through the comments that we got from Nancy and from George, and, you know, put it up against what Brenda and Caitlin and I had done, you know, it became clear that although the actual narratives may be slightly different, it seems that we were in agreement in terms of the critical components that we should, the critical components or critical items that we need to convey to the general public in terms of what this article is about. And that if we could do that first and nail those down, then, you know, fleshing it out with the appropriate narrative, I think will be a little more efficient and probably come away with a better product. So what Caitlin just handed out was a comparison that we had of what the critical components are in each of the suggestions that we got on how to approach this. And I'm just going to go through them. And then when I'm done, I am very hopeful that, you know, you'll be able to identify perhaps ones that we left out, or perhaps even, you know, ones that we should take out. But, you know, if we start from the top, you know, obviously the fund name is an important piece of this, that this fund is going to be called Capital Project Cost and Debt Service Stabilization Fund. As a little bit of background, Caitlin and Brenda and myself kind of questioned that as a name. We thought perhaps maybe a name with more specificity within it might be something that would be helpful, but we were advised by M.G.L and others that this name allows this program, we'll say bonds that are solicited under this program, to be compliant with the IRS rules for tax-free exempt bonds. So we don't want to fool with that a little bit. So the name is fine. And then as we begin to get into actual, you know, how we would explain this to the general public, you know, I think the first point to get out there is that this money exists. It's here. It's already in, I'll call it an account. It's a matter of allocating that account. So we're not talking about raising some new tranche of money. Then, you know, as you know, anytime you're going to get funds for something, you always have to identify what the use of the funds are going to be. And the use of the funds for this purpose, it would be for debt service for the Foster School and the public safety building. And I believe that the intent of this particular tactic, or maybe even strategy, had been identified at previous town meetings where the taxpayers were made aware that this was something that we wanted to pursue when and if these projects came to fruition. And again, the use of the funds would be to help pay the cost of the interest on the debt. And that the result of using the funds in this way would be a lessening of the tax burden that would be otherwise required to support this type of activity. This one here is marked new because it only appeared in one of the suggestions that we got that we should identify with specifics that these funds would be used in the first 3 years of the debt service. I think we're probably going to come back to this point, so I'm not going to stop here, but we can come back to it when I complete the others. And along those lines, the planned usage of the funds and the amounts planned to be used are consistent with the existing financial policy. So I think that's an important point for, again, the taxpaying public who may not be aware of all the various policies that exist. But this one is fully compliant with the existence of that policy. And furthermore, there's also an explanation that in addition to being compliant with the policy, there are thresholds, including the maintenance of this $2 million reserve for unexplained and unfunded events that has to take place, which these funds will not erode and not eat into. And finally, that even when it's approved, that this fund would be set up and funded, I guess a redundance there on the word, but established and funded with the monies that are identified, that the actual expenditure of the cash, the execution of payment out of this fund needs to be approved each year by a 2/3 vote at the annual town meeting. So again, I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. It's our feeling, Brenda and Caitlin's and myself, that if we can cover these 6 or 7 points and wrap them in a narrative that's a little easier reading, I think we'll have something that people can read, understand, and vote on accordingly. So that's what we have. And I am now fully open for suggestions, comments, improvements, whatever anyone thinks. Yeah.
Nancy?
Are we gonna have a hearing first before we talk about the comment?
Oh, I don't know, wait, what?
I didn't know if was there gonna be a presentation or to walk through what the fund was? No? Okay.
I don't know. It's part of the one after, but we can answer questions on it.
Okay.
Because I think the 13 is covered most of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it's helpful, Nancy, we can pause and, I mean, I don't know rules actually.
Yeah, no, I for people who may be not aware of what we're trying to do here, do we have some information that we can present to them? And I know last year when we talked about this, there was a graph of the immediate tax impact of those first years and how this fund would mitigate that impact. Do you have that information, or does Nancy have it? She can bring it up.
I don't have those charts. We just have one of the slides on the presentation for after that does cover Article C, like some of what Caitlin and Joe are talking about, the thought behind it, how the town's practice for many years has, or we've articulated the idea of using the excess unassigned fund balance in this way. I don't have that chart that George was talking about, but we could certainly come back on the 13th with it when we have kind of the recommended approach for the debt service for these projects, and then can show how we're planning to use some of the unassigned fund balance to kind of take off the peak in the beginning when the long-term debt service would hit people's bills. Because these projects will be a tax increase, as you all know. So just to have the excluded debt kind of start here and to layer these projects on like this, our thought is to use the excess unassigned fund balance to kind of ease people up a hill versus you're just facing this steep cliff in 1 year. I do think the visuals are really helpful, and we can come back to them next time.
And then if we are talking about the article, I actually think that that particular visual should probably be in the article. Because I think that visual gives a lot of people an aha moment of because I think, most reasonable people, myself included, and I think of myself as fairly reasonable, was, well, I mean, sad in the beginning, it was like, how is $7 million gonna make a difference on 150? And until you really see the chart of how the 7 million is applied and how it does absolutely impact the taxpayer.
I think, and Tom and I will talk about those considerations in the next presentation, but there is a huge difference in terms of how the debt service would hit people's bills if you pick 20 or 30 years of a principal level payment. So it does, I think we have to get closer to that anticipated approach to really show you how the unassigned fund balance would work in terms of easing that initial impact.
Time to borrow.
Right, as a time for borrowing.
And I know that we really focused last year, and I'm sorry that you guys can't see the graphic that we're talking about. I mean, it's truly like with a hockey stick, the Al Gore hockey stick. That when the tax burden kicks in on these borrowings in 26 or 27 or whatever, and as Michelle says, it does vary depending on whether it's 20-year financing and that sort of thing. But the tax burden on the taxpayer literally goes from here up to here for the first 3 years, and then it starts to come down. So, I guess, and that's my comment in regards to the 3 years, which I made back to Brenda, is maybe some confusion on my part. I know we're really focusing on the 3 years, but is our intention to use the $7 million or whatever that number is over that 3 years, or to use it over a longer period of time?
I think it depends, kind of like what Tom said too, of when we actually issue the long-term debt. Right now, the thought was if the town continues its practice of doing the ban bond, the long-term debt would hit in 26, and you have some debt retiring in 29. So that 3 years is really 26, 27, and 28 before kind of the base that we're layering on top of drops a little bit. So that's why we were thinking that would be the time frame you'd apply it. It could be for longer, it could be for shorter. If the market totally changes and we decide to go long-term right away, then it might be a different time period. But because our existing excluded debt, some of it drops off in between 28 and 29, you kind of get a little bit of, not relief, but there's a little bit of capacity there compared to the first 3 years.
So it could go longer than 3 years, or it could just be restricted to 3 years.
I mean, you could do it all just in the first year if you wanted to, but it kind of, when we're able to come back at the next meeting and kind of show all those charts, not just how we're going to apply the unassigned fund balance, but just starting with, this is the approach that, we in the select board recommend, this is what the debt service looks like, and now let's apply that on top. You can kind of play with over what period of time would you apply the unassigned fund balance. And I think Joe mentioned it, or it's on that chart of town meetings still every year going forward to use this money has to approve it. So we don't have to really make that decision right now, but you'd kind of look at, the debt service, once we go long-term, that's locked in. We can look at how much is in that account. Town meeting could move more than 7 million this fall, in the spring or something. So I think some of those decisions will be made on an annual basis of what's in the account, what does the debt service look like, when should we apply it. So I think we'll be able to show visually.
So we're not telling the taxpayer that this money will be used over a certain period of time. If I'm understanding you correctly, we will decide on a year-by-year basis how much tax relief we will give to the taxpayer.
Yes, town meeting has to do a 2/3 vote to use the
Right,
stabilization.
but somebody has to suggest the amount of money,
Yes,
and that would be determined under what basis?
I think it would depend how much.
Or is it too early to, do I really need to wait till the 13th to ask this question, or?
Better answer.
I think we'll be able to show you like the plan in terms of, on the 13th, we'll know what we think the debt service will look like. And what we'll talk about tonight is this is a very early plan. A lot of those borrowing decisions will actually be made every spring when we're going to borrow. Like we'll have to relook at the market conditions, talk of the finance team, the select board. But on the 13th, we will have, here's what we think, knowing what we know now, it will look like. And this is how we would recommend applying the 5, 6, 7, whatever $1 million amount is recommended from this article.
I've been monopolizing the time. I saw Carol's hand first.
Actually, I'm gonna defer Andy's, but Andy's waiting.
Well, I've been going from left to right, so I'm gonna go right to left.
Okay.
So
Sorry,
we'll look
I
at-
want to just step, if I can, back again, new to it. A basic, if town has to approve it by 2/3 every year, why is the fund being set up? Why isn't it just going from the current unapplied fund directly to the debt service? What's the benefit of the interim?
I think the thought is that we've long said, like, this is our intent. We've built up our reserves and unassigned fund balance, and we intend to apply it to offset the tax impact of these large projects and foster public safety. But what this article represents is like formalizing, taking a formal step to actually setting that money aside. Unassigned fund balances, can be used for a number of things, and there's already a lot of folks, there's always a lot of folks in town who have a lot of ideas for how to spend that money. So by setting it aside for these projects, it sort of protects it of
More of a
making sure that we actually have it available to use in this way.
Even though technically it could be voted to go back.
It could, so town meeting, right, so, I don't want to like jinx it, like,
No, no.
crazy pandemic breaks out, and in the spring, town meeting says, you know what? We need to pull that back because we need it to just be an unassigned fund balance for some other use. Town meeting could reverse that vote.
Thank you.
Jason,
Yeah, she stole my question.
okay. You guys gotta stop reading each other's notes. Kathy?
Okay, so I apologize for not giving you comments earlier, but in reading the beginning here, the comments, it seems to me there's 3 paragraphs here under the comments. The first one is the article asks if the town. Then the second paragraph begins with setting aside. The third paragraph begins, the town has known for many years. It seems to me that the third paragraph should be the second paragraph because it explains the rainy day fund. So that when you read as a third paragraph, setting aside these funds, it has already explained what the rainy day fund is going into the stabilization.
Can I comment on that one?
Sure.
First of all, thank you for the question, but it's this type of conversation, which was precisely why we decided to just make sure we had the critical elements there, as opposed to the organization of how the final narrative would look.
Right. Andy?
Questions, and I forgot the first one, but the second one was, oh no, the first one was based on what Michelle just said. Is it a 2/3 vote for the town meeting to take any money out of the stabilization fund? So for example, to reverse the process and put it back in, fund balance, it would take a 2/3 vote?
I think, because John, I know John and Rick are here. I think
Yeah,
it's a 2/3.
Michelle, it's a 2/3 vote. Any appropriation out of the stabilization fund is a 2/3 vote. For any purpose,
I'm putting money in
is a majority vote.
is a majority vote, which is
Right.
reason, in addition to answer Carol's question, that seems to me to be further incentive to do it this way. You get, that was my first question. The second question is, why 7 million, or where does the 7 million come from? I mean, do I wait for a week?
That's, so last year, and I should have brought that side, last year, I think we had 12 million in unassigned excess fund balance, or excess unassigned fund balance.
Yeah.
We used 3 in the April town meeting between the fire capital article and the high school tennis courts. So that brings it down probably to 9. We used one in Article 11, whatever the transfer was, to replenish the reserve fund at the end of the year. So that brought it down to 8.
It was around 9.
It was around 8 or 9, but we were talking about trying to keep 2 in excess fund, unassigned fund balance at a minimum, because when Sue and I look back at kind of the 10 or 15-year history of the use of fund balance, on average, the town would use 2 million on that replenishment of the reserve fund through town meeting every year to cover things like snow and ice, legal, storms, et cetera, and the other articles that we would use it for different capital projects. So we didn't want to recommend going all the way down to the 20% threshold that the financial policy recommends, but leaving at least that $2 million cushion. So at the time, it was looking at like around 7 million. We don't.
And then we would spend down the $2 million annually, then it gets replenished with turnbacks. So you got that $2 million going up and down every year to fund the things that we do at the end of every year. The reserve fund transfers, the little articles here and there. That was the idea.
So
That's why we got to 7.
9 plus 2.
Exactly.
So, and
And we don't yet know what was potentially added, like at the end of FY 22, who's working on all those numbers. You know, the long awaited fund balance memo will come out in the fall.
did you look at how much the stabilization fund would be if you brought it down from 20% to 16%? And what impact that would have on?
So to determine, if I'm reading it right, to determine excess based on 16 instead of 20?
I mean, you have
Getting
brought.
really far away from the financial advisors.
I beg your pardon?
You're getting really far away from the financial advisors.
Well, that was gonna be my next question. I mean, the policy is between 16 and 20%. You're suggesting 7, because that brings you down to 20. And my question is, 2 parts. The second part is Nancy's. What will be the impact on taxpayers if it reduces the fund balance to 16? Number 1, and number 2 is what would bond counsel say about that? Other than, I mean, they're grumpy anyway.
I think bond counsel is also good, but we can definitely look at that next week. I think that you guys might know the policy is better than I do, but I thought the policy says that the excess above the 20% should be used in these ways, including like targeted tax relief and paying for capital projects, that we should maintain the 16 to 20% balance, but not necessarily use excess above the 16.
That's
It was
correct.
really about the 20 number.
That's exactly what it says. The second sentence. Forward.
So I don't think we were looking at going that low. But to the extent that a number of like, say, less than 7 million was recommended this fall, say it's 5 or 6, there's always other opportunities in the spring, the following spring, to add more to this fund. Because if we're gonna look at that time frame, if it ends up being 26, 27, 28 that we apply it, you have, you know, until then to also contribute more to it, depending on how turnbacks look this year, next year, if we wanted to have more of a cushion in the meantime.
And to get back to the George's question, the intent is that the entire amount, I mean, the chart of 7 million is going to be expended in the 3 years. That's what your charts will presumably show, right?
That's what we anticipate, because the tax impact will be the biggest in the beginning, while we're still paying. So we're paying for 4 previous projects right now, and over time, that service schedule declines because it's retiring. So it doesn't make as much sense to use this money later into the project payback period, because we're trying to kind of blend that initial increase.
And so my final question, and the answer is probably obvious to somebody else, but wouldn't it be more efficient to use the money to pay down principal rather than interest?
I don't think we're making a distinction necessarily between the principal and interest. I think we're just talking about the debt service. Rick can correct me if I'm wrong, and it has to be applied a certain way, but we were just kind of looking at the cumulative tax impact of paying back debt service in that initial window.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was curious about the 7 million that we just talked about. Or just patients. Yes, the second one is more of a just saying out loud for verification. Essentially, the notion of this article is saying got this, for years, people have been clamoring, well, let's use this reserve thing. Okay, we want $7 million. And we're going to attribute it over the next couple of years based on how the dynamics say it's the best way to do it. Is that, and then makes sense.
And I think a large part of it.
In order to ease the hockey stick impact of that service of how projects come in. That's,
Right.
that's
Because the town had
moral.
been talking about foster coming for many years, because it took us 3 years to get into the MSBA program, so during that time, like the reserves were growing, and we said, but we don't want to spend it yet, these other things, let's, this is gonna be a big impact, so let's plan for it in this way.
Instead of a general savings account, it's going into a capital project savings account to be used in the best way determined. And we'll be back to you on what that is.
On those two projects.
Kind of thing.
The best way to determine is really just about like, what does that debt service schedule look like? What do we think it's gonna look like?
When it really gets.
Yeah.
What's the best way to mitigate?
Sarah?
You may have just said this. So we talked about the 7 and leaving the 2, and I'm assuming the fund balance memo will come in time to impact what we recommend to town meeting, or we don't know.
I don't know if it will, so I
Okay.
feel like something that might.
Sue's not here to kick me, so.
I'm not gonna hold Sue.
I'm gonna be Sue.
I'm not gonna rush her. I'm not trying to rush her. But if it doesn't come back in time to affect this recommendation, but it does come back with a surprising number, we could go back at this same article in the spring, right, and add more if the taxpayers
You could.
wanted to.
Yeah, I think the 7 million is an estimate. And that's why we're not trying to be dodgy on the answer to the number of years or the amounts. It's a little bit fluid, right? So something in the 1 to 3 year range, something in the 7 million range, depending on the situation at the time. I think that we need to, well, yeah, yeah, it's just that. It's a fluid situation, Sarah. I don't know how else to say it.
Okay.
Trying not to be dodgy, trying to answer as straight as we can, but that's what we know now.
Yeah.
We will have probably a much better, more concrete plan that you're all probably expecting to see on the 13th than we're bringing tonight.
Which is fine. I think it's helpful for me in understanding it to know that, we can look at these numbers again in the spring with more information. So we're not locking into it.
And every year, there's an article to use it. It's gotta go through this board, just like it does every other article of every year. So there'll be a lot of impact, or a lot of back and forth every year. So.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Nancy, did you have a question?
I just, one piggybacking on what Sarah just said. Like when we do borrowing, we put into the article along the lines of not to exceed. Are we gonna have that? Is there that kind of notational thing here if we're gonna go November 1st without an actual number? Is it kind of? Is that how you think about it?
It might be more of a John question. I think we would, in your recommended motion for November 1st, there should be a number.
So there will be a number.
We just may not have the fund balance memo, so it feels safer to use the numbers that we knew were in excess unassigned fund balance as of last year. We just won't know how much was added on top of that, so we don't want to say something bigger than we potentially have.
Okay, and then the other question that I had is are we setting, so is the stabilization fund set up in perpetuity so that can it be kind of triggered again when we do the next big project, the next fire station or the next blah, blah, blah that we do? So does this become like the stabilization fund, and sometimes it's dormant and sometimes we're adding to it as the town finances need it, or?
I'm gonna defer to Rick and John on that one.
Yeah, I think this is Rick Manley. I think the answer is that town meeting can kind of do what it would like to do with the fund. If you set it up for a particular purpose, decide after you've accomplished that purpose, or maybe you want to abandon that purpose, you can certainly take out the funds and dissolve. Town meeting can just say, okay, we'll just dissolve the fund and you can come back and set up another one if you want to at another time. So it's really, I think, all about the, I think evidencing the particular commitment of the community to this project at this time. And, I don't think you're bound to do anything further unless you feel like it. It is handy to have a fund like this maybe in future, but you can always set it up again if you should need something like that. And at the time, explain to town meeting why you think it's important to do that. Because of course, you're still going to have to go and seek an appropriation in any event.
I guess one of the things I think, before you become really versed in this stuff is the frustration of money sitting in funds and kind of has gotten a really bad rap, particularly in the last couple of years. So it does feel like it should have a purpose and have a stated purpose and use. So I like the beginning of it, but just kind of this open-ended on the backside. I just feel like that's gotten us in trouble.
I would just say, that's completely fair, but the one thing that's helpful at the moment, and it was alluded to earlier, is the how the fund relates to the issuance of tax exempt bonds. What we're hoping to avoid is the appearance to the IRS that this is a fund set up to pay debt service on a particular issue of bonds or issues of bonds, which is precisely what you're looking to do here. But that, but.
It's a recorded meeting.
Is this thing on? I don't know. Hello? But that's why we have a name that talks about addressing capital costs and offsetting debt service, right? And so it is better to have something that appears to be a bit more open-ended, bearing in mind that you can absolutely, redirect the use of this fund anytime you want. So I completely appreciate that point. We really mustn't create what's referred to in the tax code as an invested sinking fund, which would be basically we're borrowing money and we've got cash that we're going to put aside to pay that issue. It's not precisely what you're doing as such, but it looks that way. So we want to keep it as open-ended as we can on paper.
Fair enough. Thank you.
And Nancy, to your question about you don't want the money to be sitting in this fund for a long time. We're really trying to target that initial tax impact. So likely we would be moving money in now, potentially a little bit later, but then spending it fairly quickly. And I don't really see a reason for there to be a balance after we've kind of used that initial.
Right, and I'm worried more about perception than reality. Yeah.
One thing that this will do is, our excess unassigned fund balance number will go way down. So I think there'll be less when people are saying, oh, but the town's sitting in all this money. It's in a different account, and usually the most attention is drawn to the excess unassigned fund balance, which will drop to 2 million or 3 million or whatever the new number, may be instead of 12 or something that feels like a lot.
To the point earlier, once the money's in there and taxpayers see these graphics and the benefit of the potential use of this, even though, as Rick said, we don't have to use it for this, we could take it back. But I think once the taxpayers, a simple majority voted in, see that benefit and kind of feel like, that they are anticipating experiencing that benefit, I think it sets the bar higher for a situation where it would go back at a 2/3 vote, that people would undo it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, anybody else feel guilty of talking about taking money out of the fund balance without Sue being? She's on board with the plan. Yeah, sure.
I think if you do it down to 16%.
Yeah, that's true.
We didn't send her on a vacation.
I just wanted to follow up kind of Alan's comment about sort of whole idea here is that we're using the money to smooth out tax payments for Hingham residents because we're investing in very large projects. I mean, that's the underlying rationale here, is smoothing out that payment stream, which I think people will understand and appreciate. And that to me is the guiding principle behind the
Yeah, that's good to state that pretty expressly right up front.
yes.
So let me just throw out a hypothetical here. So we go to town meeting with Article C, which says $7 million. And the taxpayers say yay to one of the projects and no to the other project. Would we entertain a motion from the floor to reduce the amount of $7 million or? All right, and I guess it could stay there, but I mean, what do we do in the event that somebody says no to one of the projects?
Can I ask a question, follow up on?
John might want to answer that. I think the answer is if there's a motion from the floor, it has to be entertained by Mike. Mike's going to take it in the meeting, we'll debate it. What would we recommend based on that notion? I'd want to think about that a little bit, George, rather than the answer off the cuff, but.
No, I don't really expect an answer.
Yeah,
It's
no,
just a
no.
Hypothetical, it could happen.
Yeah.
That
No,
we
you're
don't get
absolutely right.
both approvals on both projects.
And how about if neither of Articles A or B are passed, are we still going to consider Article C? There's no reason to, so that gets, right? So we got to think about all that stuff. No, you're right, but I don't know if John wants to take that on.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those motions would be valid motions, so I think we just have to have a plan going into special town meeting as to what happens if one of two pass, or what happens if 0 of 2 pass. And, you know, Mike Puzo will be able to handle that without a problem. We do it all the time. You know, he'll probably, you know, get to Article C and say it's not necessary if the first 2 don't pass. But I think we should go in with the plan. But I think any motion on the floor to change that amount would be a valid motion within the scope.
Okay. Carol, did you?
Oh, it's just a clarification of what you were asking, that no matter what happens that day, right? A week later, we have the vote and it could get undone anyway. So aren't we gonna be back, and no matter what, we're gonna be potentially in a position to have to unvote it, if you will, reverse it. Yeah, put it back, if one or both fail a week later.
I suppose you could consider making the appropriation contingent on the, you know, successful vote at one or both of the articles if you wanted to, but that might be a little bit confusing.
And if not, you would have an article in the spring to move the money back, I think is either one of those.
Yeah.
So Article C does not appear on the ballot. It's just Articles A and B.
That's right.
Just
All right, more questions?
So I think it's a good point, that making it either contingent on the town meeting results, or just adding in a point to say if they don't pass a town meeting, we could then reverse this back at the spring.
If they don't pass at the election.
Yeah,
I think the
yeah.
election is more important.
Right, sorry, that's what
I don't know that you need to put that in the comment.
You don't think so?
Because I'm sure the ballot is gonna make it crystal clear what we're trying.
So you're voting on this prior to the actual election?
Yeah.
So are people gonna be like, well, what happened, like, I'm voting on something that we don't even know the results on? So it's better to just say like, well,
No, they're gonna have voted in town meeting. So the first of the 2 votes is John.
Yeah, I mean, my first inclination is if they pass that town meeting, the overwhelming thought is they will pass that vote. So it would seem odd that they wouldn't, not that they couldn't. So I'm not sure that we need to be building
yeah, no, that makes
beyond
sense.
that, right? Like,
Yeah.
if it happens to be that that's what happens, then we can of course go back at town meeting in the spring and not do.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about it from the vote perspective and not at the town meeting. Okay.
I just wanted to help Caitlin for a second. I think this might help you as you're writing this. And this stuff is complicated.
Yeah.
Mr. Coughlin and Mr. Manley are available to you as needed.
Yes, absolutely. And so we were just gonna collect the comments from the AdCom and then absolutely get their
Sure.
input.
Yeah, no,
So
you
thank
guys do
Tom.
your thing. It's just complicated, these guys.
Complicated. Thank you.
And more questions on this topic? All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Caitlin. And Joe, and Brenda is, I guess, leading her way east or west, whichever way she's going.
Or over the top.
Or over the top, however you get there. Okay. All right, so the next agenda item is a presentation and discussion
It's not actually.
the preliminary financing options for funding the proposed new public safety building and Foster. And I think Michelle, you and Tom are back up at the podium.
I'm just gonna stop the video for 1 minute just to sign into, but we'll still be here. I'm just gonna not display the video for 1 second.
We can try to go get a.
But now I'm just signing to my Google account and get it. You sent it to my Gmail, right?
I think George sent it to, like, George sent it out to the group, but I don't know if it's
It's attached to the agenda email.
The easiest thing to do, Nancy, maybe is to make Tina a co-host and she can share.
She can't. Very sorry, we went down that.
Oh.
Sorry.
You want me to send it to you, Nancy?
You know, that would be good so that it would be right on time.
But I think we blocked it.
You're not gonna get an email on that computer.
I'm not gonna be able to get
I
it
can
now.
forward it right now.
Any chance you have a thumb drive?
I will make.
If you just grab a thumb drive, I have it right here. I can do it real quick. We're coming back.
Go back. All right, we're just gonna need about 5 minutes, guys, while we get a file that we can present to the group here.
When are we?
Nancy, I just sent it to you via email.
All votes are going to be the 28th or so,
Okay.
that Wednesday. And we'll finalize the comments that night also.
Yeah.
So we'll probably go over all 3 comments next week, not next week, but on the 13th.
Yes, so I'm just thinking about their presentation as it relates to some of the
Yeah.
comments, finalizing the comments in here and
Yeah,
presenting that.
no, I understand you guys have looked at bunch of changes scenarios.
I could also send it to Kristen. And she could,
Kristen,
If she's got
share
it,
this?
hold on, doesn't it?
What do you need to send me?
No matter what, whoever, gets it, you're not gonna get on that computer, so.
Yeah.
Oh, because you can't show it on the screen. Is that what you're saying?
Kristen,
there.
share.
I sent it to Kristen.
I'm stuck in the soup one.
All right, we're taking notes.
I'm saying Michelle's
Tell
there.
tell Sue what happened.
I know. Just not leave us
You
again.
don't want to get right, exactly.
We're off the record. Not off the record, I mean. well,
We're still being recorded.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Can you open that, Kristen?
I haven't gotten it yet.
At the Foster School Building Committee, all of the security that has been done, the need for protection.
That subject has come up in your discussion.
They probably don't want us to know.
No,
I remember
I don't
hearing
need to
in the
know, I
present.
just need to know that the.
I remember hearing.
That
their
was the
presentation.
windows. They made a point on the windows,
Yeah.
what they're made of, that they would buy time. if you had someone outside trying to break in.
It's,
So it clearly was,
it's really not an agenda item. so
No, no.
Yeah,
we
no, no, I
discuss
know.
it, so.
Sure.
I'm curious. I think I remember that you did.
Some more time, Nancy? or-
No.
No, I'm just gonna move to another agenda.
Oh, it was already on here.
Okay.
Imagine how much fun it is to do this.
Okay,
Here we
very good.
go. Okay.
Can you see my, oh, you can see my screen. Okay, and then you still just have to share.
In the middle?
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. All right, can everybody see it?
You get a thumbs up from somebody that you all can see. All right,
Thank
thank you. Hey, Tom,
Okay.
you're up.
Okay. So thank you all for having us over here tonight. I think Michelle and I just wanted to walk through with all of you the considerations. We will not have a tax impact number tonight. That's not the intent. We're gonna try to bring that as best we can on the 13th. But tonight, we just wanted to let you all know, and some of you have seen it, folks that have been working with Tina and her subgroup and coming to some of our meetings have seen some of this, but there's a lot of information, a lot of issues that are gathered, analyzed, configured, et cetera, to get us towards this tax impact number. And we wanted you all to understand what that process looked like. So if you want to switch slides to the next slide. It's just a couple of pictures, but I could just start out just letting you know that Michelle is going to walk us through the majority of this presentation, but I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that this is really everything Michelle's going to talk about tonight is in the lead up to a recommendation from the finance team to the select board, who will ultimately make that decision on the 13th. Will help us make that decision about what we want to portray to the public, because the decision will actually happen at the times of the borrowing, with the individual borrowings. And that will depend in large part on the market at the time. So we're going to put together what we think is the scenario that will play out when we get around to borrowing. The select board will endorse that concept. And then when it comes time to issue the bond or the ban, then we will be making final decisions on that day that the select board actually has to sign off on. So that's not something the finance team does. The select board has to sign off on all the issuances. So just so you all know of that. And then next slide. Just want to let everyone know the team. These are the folks that are involved. There's a finance team that works directly for me. It's led by Michelle, who's now our ATA for finance. A number of staff people involved there. Then we have a series of expert analysts that help us from CMA. You've met Rick tonight from Bond Counsel. You met John. You all know John probably from Bogledees, Census and Coughlin, who's our general town counsel. Hill International and PMA consultants are the owner's project managers for both projects. Their analyses will be used in terms of cash flow analysis and a whole bunch of other tools along the way that will affect these decisions. We all know John Asher, our local model mechanic. He will be helping us along the way. We got off the phone with him about an hour ago. So he's front and center in everything we're doing every day. And of course, the capital project financing options team from this board will be, has been involved and will continue to be informed along the way of the things that we're doing in a way that allows for collaborative, iterative discussions with that team from the ABCOM subgroup. So that's what we've been doing. It's what we'll continue to do. And now Michelle will walk you through in a lot more detail the issues at hand.
So we did this presentation forward, and some of this was for the public's benefit, but for a second and talk about what a debt exclusion is. Sometimes people use the terms debt exclusion and override interchangeably, and they're very different. So just as a reminder, a debt exclusion is a temporary property tax increase to fund specific capital projects. And so basically, towns borrow money to pay for the large projects, and as we pay back the debt service for those expenditures, that's raised through taxes. It's because they're so large, it's not something we can fit into the regular budget. The debt service included in the regular budget is the non-excluded debt. This is excluded debt excluded from Prop 2.5, which usually limits us to only raising taxes by 2.5% every year. No, sorry. So when we're done paying for a project, typically for 20 plus years, we don't collect any additional taxes for that purpose. So that's what makes it temporary. Obviously, to many people, 20 years may not feel that temporary. It depends on for how long you might plan to be in town. Debt exclusions are one of the 2 voter approved tax increases, with overrides being the other one that we're obviously also considering this year. And as you know, it requires a 2-step approval process, town meeting and a majority vote on the ballot as well. All right, now thank you. These are the numbers that you heard from both of the building committees over the last several weeks. The first thing that we have to think about in terms of borrowing is how much do we need to borrow. So for Foster, the intent is to only borrow the town's contribution, the 88 estimated million that we would actually be responsible for. And in speaking with Rick the other day, he reminded me that typically the MSBA required vote language that you guys will be looking at for the recommended motion says that the authorization to borrow is actually reduced by the amount of the grant from the MSBA. So we're really only supposed to borrow what our expected share would be. For public safety, as you know, there's no state program that assists towns in building other municipal facilities. So we're looking at the full 46 million there for a total combined borrowing of about 134 million for all of those projects. Okay, so in evaluating how we should structure debt for large capital projects like this, these are the conversations that Tom alluded to that we've been having over the last several weeks with our broader financial team, including Tina and her crew. So I'm going to talk through the 12 that are on these slides tonight. There's probably more, but these are kind of the main ones that we've identified and have been looking at. So the first in this list is cash flow. And this is really where information from the building committees, from the OPMs help us out. So we're kind of lucky with these projects. It happens to be that these projects are coming forward at the same time and that their construction schedules is aligned, where both of them are aiming to open in the fall of winter of 2024. So a lot of, in terms of the money that they need, that's driving what we're going to borrow when. We typically borrow once a year, usually each May. And the town, if we borrow in May of 2023, the debt service on that would start to be paid in FY24. So it always hits the following fiscal year. But this whole piece is just making sure we have enough money to get the work done in the project and we don't run out of cash. So if we borrow, we talked about this, if both of these projects are approved in the fall, we are looking at probably borrowing in May of 23, May of 24, and May of 25. In speaking with the OPMs in the last few weeks and with our financial advisors, we actually might need to do an interim borrowing this time. The cash requirements, I know Jason was in one of those meetings. I think it was about 6 million for the public safety facility and 17 million or so for Foster that would be needed between November of 22 and May of 23. And we could float maybe the 6 million, but the town really can't float 20 million. So when speaking with capital markets, we may be looking at doing what I'm calling like a baby van or a minivan, maybe in the December timeframe to give us enough cash to get through May when we would do the regular borrowing. So that kind of brings us to bans versus bonds. Bans are bond anticipation notes. It's a debt instrument that towns use for the short term. Typically they're issued for 1 year and they're usually followed by or anticipated to be followed by a longer term debt issuance, a bond issuance. The town's typical practice is that we would ban for the first 2 years of a project. And for something like this, with these big multi-year construction projects, our financial advisors have advised that you really want to know how much you're going to need. You want to have, the projects almost done so that you can issue your long-term debt, knowing that these are your costs, these are your total costs, and go out to the long-term market for that. That could change though. It really depends on the interest rate markets. You see in the table here what capital markets advisors gave us on the 23rd in terms of the most recent rates for a AAA tax exempt community like us. So the band rates were still lower than the long-term. You can see the 20-year and the 30-year here. And for historically, they're still pretty good rates. They were talking about rates being in the 5%, 6%, and 8% several years ago. They're not quite as good as what we got for the water company a few years ago, but they're still low. They're still pretty good. And obviously, our credit rating being the highest from all three rating agencies, make sure that we do get the best rates that are available. With a band, you only pay interest for the first year that you have a project included. You also, if you roll that project over into another one-year band, you pay interest for the second year, but by the third year that you roll a project forward in a band, you have to start making a principal pay down. So that's also why when we talk about if we're going to bond these projects, you're just paying interest. Like the tax impact is much smaller for the first 2 years compared to when you start making those principal payments in year 3. All right, so we've talked a little bit about credit rating. We worked hard to maintain the AAA rating for 20 years. I think we got it in 2002. Having the highest credit rating allows us to maintain access to the market. So when the economy is struggling, like in 2008, 2009, et cetera, we're still able to get the funds that we need with the highest credit worthiness. We have not had to get our bands rated in the past. Typically, we've just gotten the bonds rated, but CMA is advising that they're actually seeing a savings right now in getting notes rated. It's a different rating structure, so it's not AAA. So for example, Moody's uses a MG.1, S&P uses S&P 1, Fitch F1, that's the highest rating for the bands. We may look at doing a thing fall in the spring for like the May issuance, if that's going to save us some money on interest for that 1 year. That's something we've had before, but probably worth that effort. And we did talk to capital markets advisors about how credit rating agencies view things like debt exclusions and overrides. And in particular, debt exclusions like this, if the community votes for these projects, it's an affirmative motion that people here want to invest in this infrastructure. And then obviously you have a dedicated stream of revenue from taxes paying it back. So Janet was saying they're typically viewed as credit positive. The next one is competitive versus negotiating sales. We typically do competitive sales because that usually allows you to get the best interest rate. But sometimes there are special circumstances that might warrant a negotiated sale. And that's what we did with the water company purchase, because something like that was a new entity where there wasn't a lot of credit history, there wasn't a lot of revenue history. So that was a case where it made more sense to do a negotiated sale. You could make sure that you were getting favorable terms. I think that the next two ones are some of the biggest ones that really impact the tax impact, the term and the repayment structure. So the term is how quickly you want to pay back that debt. The maximum for both of these projects is 30 years. And I think in the past, we've typically borrowed for 20. Rick may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the maximum was expanded to 30 years more recently.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. And it may make sense to borrow for a longer period of time for these projects just because of the size. So that's something that we're evaluating. And speaking with Rick and Janet, both of them let us know that most other communities are borrowing for 30 years for these projects and doing it in a level payment structure. So in terms of level principal or level payment, that's how you structure the debt service. Level payment is like most people's mortgage, a conventional 30-year mortgage, right? You pay the same amount every month, but within that amount, the principal and interest is changing. So you've got a lot more interest from the beginning, a lot more principal at the end, but it gives you some budget certainty of like, what your payment's going to be. And that's probably why a lot of these communities are choosing the level payment because of the size. Our debt service would be level over time. What that means though, is that we're paying more in interest for the project overall. The longer the term and level payment means the interest cost goes up. On the other hand, level principal means that the amount of principal you pay off every year is the same. So your interest costs go down over time. So it means that you have a declining debt service schedule. So in one hand, that's good. You pay you pay less interest overall for the project, but the people in Hingham now will pay kind of a disproportionate share of that project. You'll pay more upfront than the folks who live here 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But it depends on you're looking at, but you need to be getting the same benefit from the school or the public safety facility. So that's more like an equity consideration of like how you want to spread this out over, the population of Hingham over time. Financial policy guidelines, as you guys all know, there's a whole debt section of the financial policy that talks about has a lot of different parameters and guidelines. So that's something that we need to look at when we're looking at these different scenarios with capital markets advisors on the select board over the next few days or weeks. Next slide. Okay, so this one talks about our debt capacity. The first sub bullet under there is according to state law, basically, that the town can't issue or have outstanding at any particular time debt that exceeds 5% of the valuation in town, the total taxable property, which for us is about 8 billion. So that limit as of last year is 397 million, leaving about, if you look at what we have outstanding according to the state statute, it leaves us about 354 million available. Our financial policy talks about considering things like MSBA debt in there. It talks about HMLP. I mean, we did the water issuance. So if you put all of that, if you include all of that in the debt limit, which again, we don't have to do legally, but if we just as a policy do, we still would have some room for these projects. But water is excluded from the state limit, and so is Foster would also be. An MSBA project is also excluded from that limit. So according to the state, we're really looking at the 46 million for public safety that we have to fit in there, and clearly there's capacity. But we have to be mindful of other capacity that we have, such as like, what other capital projects are coming down the line. So if we're thinking about the wharf walls or the senior center, we want to make sure that however we structure this debt, we have to be mindful of, we may be asking people to invest in other infrastructure projects down the line, and want to make sure that that's also affordable. The floor of this is kind of the existing excluded debt. I mentioned that we're paying off 4 old projects for previously excluded projects, and that's the chart you see at the bottom. This is the chart that we're talking about layering the new debt service on top of that to see what the tax impact would be. And it's the same chart where once we do that, we kind of bring in the cash from unassigned fund balance to shave some of those bars in the early years. But you can see here, and everyone on Zoom can see that you see some debt is retiring in 2028. So that's a little bit of a drop off. So when you layer everything on top of it, it helps you when you get to 29 a little bit. Market conditions are like one of the most obvious ones. I mean, we rely a lot on capital market advisors for this. Like no one has a crystal ball, but it's kind of looking at how interest rates are trending and what's going on economically and where we think things might go, if it will get better or worse. And that informs a lot of this, the bands versus bonds, the interest rates and assumptions that we might use to have our debt service projections. Legal restrictions, that's really where Rick and John come in and make sure that as the state issues new guidance around borrowing, like they changed their guidance last December, I think, about how you could use bond premiums. They came out with something recently about excluded debt in particular and kind of inflation costs. So we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're in compliance with the current restrictions and regulations. Number 11, taxpayer impact. That's mostly what everyone cares about and what all these are kind of driving towards. How much will these projects cost me as a taxpayer? What kind of value am I getting for them? So that's really what we're going to come back to talk with the select board about in 2 weeks and likely with the advisory committee as well. And as we consider these 2 projects and their tax impact, we're also mindful that we're also likely proposing a sizable override in the spring. So we need to be, mindful that there's another ask coming in the spring and trying to get folks as much of a sense as is possible right now of what that might look like. And then we already discussed number 12, use of the cash that we have, the reserves that we have to help mitigate this tax impact of these large projects. Do you want me to skip over this? Because this was really the Article C discussion that we had.
I think so.
Okay. We talked about John Asher, former advisory committee chair, but our like model mechanic extraordinaire. He, over the last few years with other folks like Jim Taylor and Mary Powers and others, have developed this a pretty sophisticated financial planning model. We used it a few years ago in the budget process. We used it for the Sustainable Budget Task Force report, and that version of the model is on the website right now. He's been helping us tweak this, updating it with now like our preliminary FY24 forecast numbers. As we get these scenarios and interest rate assumptions from capital markets, he'll plug that in. And this model really allows you to play with a lot of inputs. I know Tina's group went through a training with him on kind of how you can manipulate this. But you can look at everything from changing the cost of the projects, the years that you want to borrow over, level principal, level payment, what years you want the debt service to hit. You can also put in operating override amounts in there. And then you can also change it on the assessed value to see, what it would cost people at different levels of homes in town. He also added functionality, because he's amazing, in terms of using the unassigned fund balance to offset the tax impact. So you can even plug in 3 million in this year and 2 million in that year and kind of see. So that will be updated and on the website too, probably when we get closer to the 13th. So folks can play with that as well. But understanding that is, the financial model is pretty complicated and most people might want something simpler. We're also working on a simple tax impact tool, like a calculator, where people would enter their address and it would tell them the estimated impact of the projects and potentially like an estimate of the floor of the override in the spring. We're still working on that and you can talk to the select board about it. But other towns have done that. I live in Braintree. They did a debt exclusion a few years ago. You popped in your address, it told them what the cost would be. That really helped people, consider whether or not they wanted to support a project. But the other next steps are, we expect the scenarios to come back from CMA this week, and hopefully we'll be able to talk with the select board.
Capital market advisors.
CMA and capital markets advisors are the financial advisors that the town's worked with for many years. We'll finalize that model. We'll get the tax impact tool on the website, and then, as Tom mentioned, we're coming back to the select board September 13th with the recommended approach with the estimated tax impact, and that's kind of the main information that everyone's looking for at this point. Thank you for driving the slides.
Thank you for walking through it.
Questions?
So just one point of clarity on the question. So going back to the debt limit, the 397, I get that's the 5% of the 8 billion roughly. 354 million available, so the spread of 43. Is that's all current issued debt, or is that the excluded debt?
That's issued debt. That's not just excluded.
So that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
So we have barely 11% of our capacity. So that's good.
And that's the debt that's subject to that. So I don't think, Rick can correct me again if I'm wrong, I don't think that middle school, which was an MSBA project, would be in there. The water's not in there. The water was 111 itself, but that's not subject to that.
Those are special bonds. Okay, so to that end, then as we think about, again, a lot of this stuff, and I'm not sure how much of it is relevant to the articles or whatnot, but these type of statistics, which is very interesting to me, right? Like fundamentally, I look at this on a piece of paper and I'm like, well, geez, like I'm not even sure what the issue is per se. Kind of gets more to the point that perhaps we've been too stingy in our capital projects beforehand. Like, I don't know how this stacks up from a town by town basis. I don't know how important that is, but that's just a point that kind of immediately comes to mind for me. And then the second piece too is sort of that just focusing specifically on the debt exclusion side. Again, I think we talked about this before, to the degree to which like Hingham has not done a lot of this in the past, that if you looked at the tax burden from a town perspective, perhaps we're very underweighted through exclusions. Like, I just don't know how those things all break down, and I don't know how easy it is to gather that information, but there's a part of it that says if we stack up incredibly well the towns that town people would think that we would be compared to, that might be information we wanted to buy them. But then again, it may not be that easy to get. I don't know.
A lot of it's in the Sustainable Budget Task Force. The comparisons town to
They
town
are.
of what we have for debt. And it is very interesting.
was gonna say, a lot of it is, like, we crunched some of those numbers, and maybe we'll need to update some of that analysis too, but the state DOR, their municipal data bank is awesome. So you can literally look at these types of indicators for all 351 communities. I was doing some research on debt exclusions for one of the select board members last night, and just quickly pulled up who did a debt exclusion in FY 20, 21, 22, and 23, to kind of just look at like what are the recent projects out there. Missing from that one in particular is the amount of it, but you can see who did public safety, who did schools, and the pass rates are, like, the success rate in terms of getting them are very high for both of them. There's info on overrides, single family tax bills. I would definitely take a quick glance at the Sustainable Budget Task Force report, that section of it. Is it a revenue section? I forget. But I can send that to you if you want. And then the data bank really has like so much information
That would be great.
on all these different indicators. And we typically look at the benchmark communities that you could look at. You can see everyone's bond rating and kind of look at other AAAs. The way that I did it for the override research we're doing was I took, I wanted to see who did big overrides, like over 5 million in the last 3 or 4 fiscal years. And then I took out anyone who was above or below 50% of Hingham's population. There's a lot of little keep towns and Western Mass towns that have to do overrides all the time, just because there's like 600 people that live in those towns and there's not a lot of revenue, but they're much smaller. I left in a few like Arlington and Shrewsbury that were bigger, but there were a number of towns that did like $5 to $10 million overrides recently, and then we talked with them. So it's really helpful to get a quick snapshot of like who else out there is dealing with these. And debt exclusions are much more common than overrides. I think people understand that there's really no way in the budget to do these large infrastructure things. But overrides, you know, they're a tool that properties have put in place, and a lot of communities are using them as well.
I just want to make sure I understood. So $43 billion is the current outstanding excluded debt, exclusive of the water company and the middle school.
I don't think it's just excluded. I think it's also our non-excluded debt.
It's all debt.
All debt.
That's subject to
in
that limit.
school or water. Does that mean dedicated?
Right, I think sometimes it's easy to kind of conflate what's excluded from 2.5 from what's called outside of the normal debt limit. The normal debt limit for the town is 5% of its current EQV at the time debt's authorized. That's where that number is really quite large. But an awful lot of big ticket items are issued under the portion of the statute, chapter 44, section 8, which is where the water debt was authorized, or part of how the water debt was authorized. So that's not counted. That's a big piece right there. Any MSBA funded projects are going to be excluded as well. And there are many other ones too. Sewer bonds, for example, are like that as well. So, or can be. So at the end of the day, it's possible to have a meaningful amount of outstanding debt, but only a modest amount is really subject to the debt limit. I think the debt limit is a very old-fashioned construct. You know, there's nothing magic that the town should be able to, you know, afford to pay back 5% of their EQV in debt. I mean, look at that number and you say, boy, that would be, yes, we could issue it technically, but how would we ever pay it back? So anyway, but it is something that's sort of at least technically out there. We usually see it coming into play with respect to the smallest of communities that might, you know, be stuck doing a good sized project like a very rural community that has to put in a wastewater plant, for example, something like that.
Okay, so does the exclusion of the MSBA debt exclude the total amount of debt for the school, or just that portion that's being paid by the state? So when you said that,
From this limit, you mean?
I'm sorry, when you said from the, so you said from the debt limit, the water company debt is excluded, and the MSBA school money is excluded.
Yes.
Does that mean the total amount? So for example,
113 million would be excluded, would need to be accounted as, was the debt limit?
I think it would only be the 88 because we only plan to borrow the 88, excuse me. So it's really just whatever the town actually borrows for those
Okay.
MSBA funded projects.
All right.
Yes, that's right. I don't know that you've seen yet the form of vote that the MSBA would require a grant-funded project community to adopt. But it has language at the end that says the total amount authorized will be reduced to the extent of the grant amount set forth in the project funding agreement. So for all practical considerations, the part that we worry about is really that, which is the net share to the town.
And one last question. The 8 million for the pool is included.
Yes, I believe it is a debt exclusion to help pay for it, I believe, but it is subject to the debt limit, yes.
It's excluded debt, but it's.
It is excluded.
It is excluded. We know. It's always great to talk about including the excluded debt, like in this limit, but.
So the pool was excluded as well?
Yeah,
just
yeah,
not-
we voted for it at the polls. The pool was like the most recent debt exclusion we've done.
But I think on some level, isn't this just an esoteric conversation? Because at the end of the day, it's not really what our debt capacity is, it's what the voters will allow us to borrow. So.
Any questions from members that are viewing it from afar? Raise your hand. So,
Gina has a question.
okay, yes, Tina.
So I have a question. I'm not sure if it belongs in this conversation or in the next part of the agenda. But I've been thinking about this, and I have been lucky enough to, we went through John Asher's model and saw all the different items that could be entered, all the different figures. And on September 13th, when we get the debt impact, or when we get the impacts of the debt exclusions, are we also going to get, like when we go to vote for this, I'm trying to figure out how to say this more clearly. When we go to vote for this, these two articles at the end of September, I was hoping that we would have been able as an advisory committee to look at the impacts of the debt exclusions and the 5-year forecast and the potential override, and look at the impact of different growth rate scenarios like we did last year. Those were some of the most instructive conversations I thought we had. So I didn't want to just see the debt exclusion impacts by themselves, but as part of the bigger picture, like how this all is going to work together, because we're facing this operational override in the spring. And I think all of these things need to be kind of considered as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think what we'll be able to at least present this fall would be the floor of the override, like looking at the FY24 forecast and deficit now, which is very preliminary, is 4.88 or 4.9 million. So the override is definitely not going to be less than that. It's likely going to be more than that, but we can look at the tax impact of that. But it's hard to say. We really won't have more information for what it actually might be, because we'll just be putting budgets together at that point. It will really be over the winter and spring that we get more clarity of what the final request may look like.
Yeah, I think it's fine that it's preliminary, but I remember that when we plugged the hole with the override, when we were looking at this last year, I was always surprised to see that in a short period of time, another override became necessary. And so I just want to really understand the entire picture. I mean, these projects are critical and I understand that, but I want to really understand the whole picture. And I really want to talk about that as a committee and make sure that we're all, you know, looking kind of at the same numbers and the same impacts.
I think you raised some good points, Tina, and I'm sure that the taxpayer at the special town meeting will also want to have an idea of what the override is going to be. As Michelle said, we're not going to have a good number, but Tom has stepped up to the podium and I think has some additional comments he could make on that. So,
to the extent we want to talk about it, Tina, it's exactly right. We're going to be talking about, as part of the tax impact analysis, I think in the next slide there, or the next step slide, we talked, and Michelle talked about adding the floor of the forecast, the
override.
thank you, the deficit, the floor of the deficit from the forecast document directly into the analysis. I think we also, though, have to take into consideration growth rate considerations, Tina, that you mentioned. And that's all part of what will be fed into this model by the select board as they're considering likely scenarios that we're going to end up in. I will say that I think that some conversations have started around what some other towns have been doing in terms of determining how best to go forward with an override in their communities. And that's generally been what is often referred to as the Arlington model. I don't know if you guys have talked about it or not.
we have not talked about
it. So there's something called the Arlington model out there, which is around the state where a combination of multiple boards, whether it's the school committee, the advisory committee, the select board, all together working to come up with a commitment, if you will, not a legal one, but a verbal one vocalized loud and proud to everybody in town, that there will be some limitations put forward if an override is passed. For instance, the number of years between overrides, target 4 or 5 seems to be the general goal. No, we won't be back to you for another override in less than 4 years, less than 5 years, something like that. Growth rates are going to be held to X percentage on town operated municipal operations and X percentage on school operations and X percentage on joint operations. So there's these different considerations that need to be brought forward by all three and agreed to by all three parties if the town is going to go into this with an eyes wide open approach to making their vote. And I think that's what the select board has been talking about, moving that concept forward along with the tax analysis, the tax impact analysis. I don't know, Tina, if we're going to have a draft MOU by the 13th. I don't know if I can promise you that, but it's the concept is being discussed among the leaders in the town, and I think that it's getting traction. So that's what I can tell you.
Yep. And Tina's point that the projections that we have seen in the past are for increasing deficits going forward. So I think Tina's point is, all right, if you have a $5 million deficit next year, your override is $5 million. What about the following each of the following 3 years?
Right.
How are you going to meet the deficit there?
And I think, Andy, the point is well taken, and certainly the models that we put in show that. But what Tom is talking to, and you know, frankly, this Arlington model is something that I would plan to bring before the committee once we're beyond the November special town meeting, and we begin to talk about the override. But it's very much a fluid process. There's a lot of concern with how frequently do you come back and with the rate of growth of the expenses. And so there's something, and I suspect in November, should the question arise from the floor, somebody will be prepared to talk, you know, with a little bit more specificity, excuse me. Although I don't expect to be able to be finalized by that point either. But it's definitely the points that Tina has raised and you have raised have been raised in additional conversations that Nancy and I have been part of, and Michelle and Tom and I have been part of with towns like Arlington and Shrewsbury and Norwood, and I'm hoping to speak with Winchester in the future. But this Arlington model is one that a number of people have looked at, have found favor with certain parts of it, and tried to incorporate that in the override, in the agreement, if you will, with the taxpayer. You know, if you allow us to raise taxes X dollars, we will promise to do Y on the other side. So that we're not coming back to you, Tina, every 2 years, or Andy, as you point out, in the models you've seen, that deficit just keeps going up. So,
But if I had an anecdote,
absolutely.
so just anecdotally, Andy, the control, the key piece of that question is the growth rate and how you control the growth rate. And when we plug in what we feel, well, you got to properly size an override up front, then you control growth going forward. If you do that, and given our advanced modeling and truly, you know, wild scenario planning, because we don't have any specifics, I think we're seeing that we can solve that 2 and 3 year window problem and get to year 5 before another override would be needed. So if that helps any, it's anecdotal, it's not real numbers, but we were obviously concerned about that too. It's the growth rate control that's the key point.
Well, I think though that we were a long way from where we were a year ago in terms of that, because the Sustainable Budget Task Force was put together and agreed upon by the major boards in town. And there is a growth rate in there that's specified.
Staff.
Right, and that was agreed to. And so if we can, I think we're a lot further in flushing that out and communicating it to the town than we were a year ago. And I think we as AdCom, not, you know, us as this body, but as a committee, you know, when we went forward into COVID with that understanding with the town, I think that gained a lot of credibility. I mean, we went to the town and we said, we're gonna go forward with this budget, but this is what we're gonna do, and we did it. So I just think we're a lot further along than, and we've shown that we know what the issue is, and we know how to talk about it. So I feel a lot more confident, maybe wrong, but I feel a lot more confident than like last year when we, you know, that first time that Dave ran us through the numbers, and I think everybody wanted to get sick. So I think we're a long way from there.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
On that point too, we also have the precedent of the FY21 financial management plan, so.
That's what I was referring to.
Yeah. So like when Victor
Yeah.
thought he'd finished his budget process and then the pandemic hit, I mean, that was a written and adopted, like voted on by all 3 committees, and it said, if we have a revenue hole, the schools are gonna make up 60% of it, and the municipal departments will make up 40%, and that's how we'll get through stuff, and we will basically stop hiring people, and we'll kind of slow down on capital and slow down on expenses and just see how this goes. And now we're talking about something kind of good of potentially right sizing some of our operations, but then saying, that's kind of it. This is our chance. And then we got to make sure that we're growing responsibly after that. So I think that's helpful. The Sustainable Budget Task Force and having kind of a partnership across different committees is helpful. So it's not completely new to us. And then there's a lot of examples out there from other towns. And you guys are welcome to share that research if you want with everyone.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I didn't hear your last sentence.
Oh, I said we had done some research, but we had put the notes together from the conversations that George talked about with the other communities, and that's, people are welcome to take a look at that if they want.
Additional questions? So Michelle, can I just ask a question, and I may be a little too premature on this, but looking at the financial policy, and I think Rick alluded to some of this, but So annual debt service for the policy is not to exceed 10% of total annual expenditures for an extended period of time. Again, maybe I'm too early on this, but I'm assuming that we're looking at least some period of time where we would be in excess of that 10%.
I don't know yet, because we would need the debt service schedules to then kind of look at, do those calculations and come back with those on the 13th as well. That was something that Tina brought to my attention when we were talking. She had gone back in time and looked at how that policy had changed over time, and it looks like the town over the years kind of raised it from 5 to 7%, now up to 10. And I don't know if that was because we had different projects going on, but we'll certainly do that calculation when we have the recommended approach and look at that table.
My recollection is we've been over that 10% number in the past. I'm just trying to think, looking at some of the schedules Jim Taylor and John Escher put together. Okay. I'm not sure. Thank you. Further questions? Questions from AdCom members zooming in? No further questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You too.
It doesn't matter, It's got like your handiwork. Good night.
Okay. So the next agenda item is a review and discussion of the recent presentation to AdCom by the Public Safety and Foster School Building Committees. And if you remember, it seems like just a short time ago, but it's longer, I'm sure. And when we started talking about asking these folks to come in and talk to us, the question was, what information do we need to feel comfortable to come forward with a recommendation to the voters at town meeting to go forward with these projects or not go forward or whatever. So we've met with each of these folks twice, had detailed conversations with each of them on one occasion, and had overview presentations on another. So and let me just throw it out. Do we want to see anybody come back? Do we feel we have enough information at this point? And if we're going to ask them to come back, then the date would be September 13th, where we could ask one or both to come back and sit down and go over a few points that we are not clear on or that we need more information on. So I will throw it open. Carol.
Just my question is, I don't know if you've heard back. I think when we were left with some open questions they were going to get back to us on. You haven't heard anything back. I know I can go back to my notes, but I think it had to do with some comparisons with other towns, but I felt like there was still some
Public safety building was
yeah.
with some comparisons.
There's still a few open
putting
items.
that together, yeah.
We've not seen those yet.
Okay. I don't know if that entails coming back, but I am interested in what those answers were.
Yeah, I think do you want to follow up with Bob on this?
They've been a little busy this week, but
I'm not even sure if the timing, like that's the piece I don't remember, is if they said, well, we can't do that until, but.
No. I think that's the architects putting it together. I just meant they've been doing all the permitting boards in the past 2 weeks. And I don't know if you guys have had the pleasure of watching any of those meetings, but.
But do you want to share what Tom shared
Yes, we
with
have great
us?
news. Or the committee has great news. So the Public Safety Facility Building Committee met with the planning board last night. And they did get an affirmative vote on the application for planning board approval. And the big thing is that matters to us is that step, getting that approval now allows them to go forward with the construction cost estimates. And he is expecting that to be ready in 7 to 10 days. So we'll actually have it on the 13th.
Okay.
We should be discussing the article again, so.
And they do not need conservation approval, so they're good to go at this point. Okay. All right. Um, Other comments, questions about bringing people back to see us?
Opposite, Foster.
Yes.
You're more familiar.
Yeah, okay, so, so I watched the Conservation Commission, meeting last night with Foster. It is, it has been a slow process, as I think you might expect, given the location of Foster and the issues with that site. But the Conservation Commission is, they're still asking questions and they're still looking for additional information. And so they have scheduled a follow-up meeting for next Wednesday, I believe it is. So they have gone from having Foster as being one of the agenda items on their meetings to now essentially holding special meetings on Foster, where they're spending 2 hours, 2.5 hours, whatever, back and forth between commission members and the architects and the building committee. There are obvious concerns with flooding, with climate change. With climate change versus where we are right now, which, climate change seems to be accelerating all of the issues and problems with coastal flooding and that sort of thing. So it's, it's a difficult issue. It is a, 50+ year building that we're putting there, and climate change is going to, have a dramatic effect on that school. So it's, it's a matter of trying to make the school as safe as possible, as protected as possible, and to consider all of the effects of climate change, some of which are still somewhat conjecture because we don't know what it's going to be like 20, 30 years down the road.
George, when did you say the next meeting was? I think you just said it with Concom.
Yeah.
Wednesday, you said.
I think it is next Wednesday.
I could look it up.
They have 3
Thank you.
more. They have the 7th, the 12th, and the 19th, or what's kind of the big plan.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what does the calendar look like?
7th is the 4th hearing,
The 7th is the 4th.
the 12th, the 5th is hearing. This is your calendar.
And there,
Seventh
the
is now.
select board is tentatively supposed to vote on the 20th. But that doesn't totally make sense to me because the planning board isn't done yet.
Yeah. So select board may vote the same week as we did last week of the month. I can send the Zoom link from last night's meeting around to everybody.
Awesome. Thanks. Oh, maybe you
Yeah.
did.
I think you
I
did.
think you did.
Yeah.
I haven't watched it yet. You did send it.
I apologize, I saw the link, I haven't watched it either. What is the Conservation Commission view as its role in the water school project?
The role is to make sure that it complies with the town bylaws, state laws, and wetlands.
Which it clearly does. One would assume. Right? I have faith in the people we've hired to do the planning. One would assume that sort of is a base level. But, so I'm wondering how far beyond that the Conservation Commission is sort of going. I mean, you could go on
Yeah,
forever with.
You could. I mean, and their concern is that you know, the town is investing a lot of money into this project. It is in a, you know, if we had a choice, would we put a school there? I think everybody's in agreement we would not. You know, if there were a viable alternative site, probably wouldn't put it there. But that is the site, and so if you're going to put it there, how do you make that site as secure and safe as possible for not only what the current climate situation is, but since it's a 50-year project, it's going to look like 10, 20 years down the road. So,
And I guess what I'm wondering is whether that's their charge. You know, if the project meets
well, and
current
that-
standards,
that's-
then, you know, I understand they might be concerned, and it's nice to hear the concerns, but you know, that's not your job. Stay in your lane.
It's not our job either, though. I think that's the select board's job to tell them to stay in their lane.
Pardon me?
I said, it's not our job either.
I don't think they're going outside their lane. I think they're asking questions that might make the building committee think a little bit. Situations they haven't fully considered. So,
I should, before I even hold on to know, I should look at the videos of the hearings.
yeah, there's, you know, and some of those discussions took place during the meeting. So I think it would be worthwhile looking at. But it is, you know, I certainly don't expect them to vote next week on it. I expect they will get some answers to their questions, and that may prompt more questions.
George, are any of the questions leaning towards remediation that's gonna add tangible costs to the project, or are they just trying to get their arms around?
I haven't seen any cost implications on anything they've talked about. A lot of it is clarification on how was the studies done, and what things were taken into consideration. So some discussion around that. So,
George,
yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can someone stop sharing the screen? It's hard to see. You guys.
yeah.
Someone.
Oh, I think it's you, Nancy.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Tina.
You know, and I'm certainly not suggesting that council is not going to give them an approval. I have no basis to say where they're going to come down on this thing or how they're going to come down on it. I'm just saying that I, as an interested citizen, sit there and watch the presentations and the discussions and back and forth sort of thing. I think they have some concerns about it. And again, it's you know, if we're going to build a school there, how do we make sure that we make a school that's there in 50 years or 60 years? And what steps can be taken to remediate some of the changes in climate that we're seeing play out here, which may be in excess of what floodplain maps look like. So I mean, it's an evolving situation. But it is a process.
And that gets to Jason's point, which is at some point, you could see that the costs go up.
Better they don't vote for it.
Sure.
I did hear it was kind of accurate.
More questions? Okay.
So I guess my answer to your question is I don't see, subject to Carol's very good point, that we were promised some answers. I don't personally feel a need to bring people back at the moment.
Might something change, Andy or anybody, that, you know, just so that we can give a heads up to the building committees that we might want you to come back?
Only if they think things are going south before the planning board or conservation commission.
Yeah, how costs are being impacted if the costs are being materially impacted above where we're doing the numbers, because I think at the end of the day, right, that's trying to get to articles A and B.
Well, the numbers can't go up beyond the 113. Well, that's what the state is saying. So the town can pay for the difference between 113 and 115, 18, 20, 25, but that gets into a different kettle of fish. So. Okay, what about any of EdCom members zooming in? Are there any desire to ask either the foster or public safety committees to come back?
I don't have any reason to bring him back. Joe Griffin.
All right, good. All right, thank you. Okay, then moving to the next agenda item. So we have so we were scheduled to review the first draft on the foster comment and the second draft on the public safety building. And we're going to defer public safety until our meeting. Al has distributed a copy of the first draft of the comment on foster. You want to take us through it, Al? Have any comments from anybody? I know when I was late this morning.
Nancy did some editing. Prepared and fairly self-explanatory. There's more to fill in. The most glaring, obviously, the tax impact. I think it's a first stab at sort of formatting the major points, and we'll keep tinkering.
I thought it was excellent. I mean, you know, might be some tinkering here or there, but it's a pretty comprehensive presentation set forth pretty logically.
Details come from Kristen, and I formatted.
My only comment was, and I have to spend more time with it than I did, but in the financing section 4, where the second sentence says, well, it said of the total budget, there are certain non-reimbursable items per MSBA guidelines. For instance, the MSBA defines construction costs above $360 per square foot as ineligible for reimbursement. Current construction costs are predicated to be around 500. And I think we were told that the MSBA is aware that their per square foot limitation is inadequate in the current building climate. Weren't we told that?
And then talking about it was the implication argument, not that they're about to change it.
Oh, no, they're not gonna change it, but they're entirely aware that it's not a realistic number. And if that's the case,
Right.
then I would add that. I don't want the people to come away thinking that we're extravagantly spending 140 the extra dollars per square foot the state thinks is unnecessary. So I guess just check with them, because I was sure I heard Ray say that the state is aware of the inadequacy of this number.
I think that's one of the things that he was getting back to us on, in the sense that saying other towns are also spending. I mean, we all know construction costs have gone up a lot, but still other towns have been spending more than that base amount. So that this is a relatively common issue of being higher.
Yeah.
I thought that's what he was gonna get back to us with a little bit of the what's happened in other towns with that same issue.
Can I add something in?
Sure, go ahead, Kristen.
I think that his point as well was that they are aware that the amount per square foot is low, but that's also so they're able to fund other schools. If they were to give a higher amount, they would be able to do less projects a year. So I think was another reasoning that they gave for that.
Right. do you want to just reach out to Ray and see if he can give us a little more context on that?
And if I were to paraphrase though, or say differently, I think what you're saying is we don't want to lead voters with the townsfolk with the impression that we're overspending.
Precisely.
That fundamentally, they have this reimbursement cap, just happens to be, it is what it is for whatever particular reason, but that fundamentally the cost per square foot. It's sort of the question I asked, I think, the other day, which is, there are these Byzantine rules around bidding. I mean, we're trying to get the lowest cost possible, which just happens to be the current environment. So, I could look at it a little bit closer, maybe offer some language, but I think that's what we're.
That's
trying to
precisely the point I was concerned with. I don't feel that we are being extravagant
Right.
spenders, and I don't want someone to think that we are because the state has.
It might be helpful if we knew the history of that. Is that 350 from when the legislation was initially put together 10 years ago and hasn't changed, hasn't adjusted for inflation or anything?
Yeah, that could tell a lot.
That might be helpful to the taxpayer too.
Yes,
I also would pick up on what you just said. I like the concept of capped rather than defines.
that's a great observation.
Which I think more accurately conveys what they do. I mean, it's
Yes.
not like they define construction costs for all construction of school buildings. It's that they decide that this is what we can spend, and that's what you get.
Yeah, and as Kristen said, they want to pay some portion of more projects rather than all, or a higher portion of just a few projects.
Good.
Just one comment related to the operating cost savings. I think I like how we're talking about that 37,000 per year that's coming down, but we're not talking about the upfront investment that we're putting in there. And so I think we should just make sure we're including language around like the payback period. It seems like, right, because we're saying one of the major, it's not a major driver, but it's an additional driver cost of the investment we're putting into the mechanical systems to make them net zero, which is then going to, over time, reduce the cost savings, but so it's just not coming across that way. That makes sense. That was interesting. I thought this was really well written. I think you did a great job on this.
I hope the part of custodian training on how to maintain the aging boilers. Get a bigger hammer.
We've all seen those 18 boilers.
Exactly.
Good. Okay. Any additional comments? Please forward them over to Al, or should we send them to Kristen, or both? Or how do you want to get this?
Send you.
Okay. All right. Okay. Next agenda item is liaison reports. Do we have any reports? We talked a little bit about public safety building, a little bit about conservation. Any reports from anybody now?
Country Club pool moving forward, got planning board approval.
Okay.
And they've signed a new contract with the OPM on this phase. And doing some sort of site engineering and sort of carving out a few things to keep at the budget of $8.5 million. The total project cost as it sort of wound up was about $300,000 over. So they're for now eliminating some of the bubble blower and having the DPW do fill work and those kinds of things to reduce costs to keep it at the 8.5.
What is the timing for that, Ellen?
To open July 2023.
July 23.
Yeah.
And all the Foster schools.
About to start, they're getting ready to start. They'll do the construction 22.
All the foster school students have to learn to swim.
That's part of the mitigation.
And thank God they can do it year round.
That's- well,
Free
not yet.
galoshes for every student.
That's great. Okay.
I have an update from the Affordable Housing Trust meeting. It was actually on the 17th of August.
Okay.
Two things that were on our radar. They did mention potentially we'll be asking for about like 500,000 for CPC, for the CPC, like applying for that amount of money when the time comes around next year. And then the other thing they talked about was submitting a recommendation to the planning board related to ADU usage from that standalone perspective versus being having to be on a property attached to a different house. And then the ability to rent those ADUs for affordable housing.
There is the question of accessory dwelling units detached came up a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And was assigned to a study committee. So under the jurisdiction of the planning board. And their report, I believe, is due this year. With the idea that maybe they go to town meeting in the spring. And the driver is Ray Estes, who first submitted a citizen's petition on the detached ADU. And so he was on that committee. Where it stands, but so affordable housing will coordinate with him. He and affordable housing would certainly be of similar views. Others may not.
Anything else? Anybody watching, AdCom members? No? Speak further? Okay. All right, the next agenda item is a discussion of the AdCom housekeeping items. The next meeting, as we have discussed, is September the 13th. And then I'm looking at meeting on September the 28th, which is a Wednesday. We would, and it's and Tuesday is a holiday. That's why we meet on a Wednesday. So we would vote these three articles and finalize comments. And if we are not able to finalize comments or finalize our votes, then I would ask you to set aside Thursday, the 29th, for us to do that.
I can't be in the paddle.
And so the last item that I wanted to just bring up is the year-end AdCom appreciation event, otherwise known as the AdCom party, which Kathy, you're fully aware of, but Jason and Carol, you may not be, and Lindsay may not be. But at the end of the year, in appreciation for all of the hard work that and that we have put various people through in town departments and various committees and that sort of thing. It is a tradition of AdComs that we host a party. The last few years that we've had a party, we've had it down at the Heritage Museum. Lovely facility. And the planning for this party falls to the new members. But probably the best party that we've had was last year's, and Sarah and Caitlin and Pat, who's no longer
And
with us.
Matt, but and.
And Matt, who
Caitlin,
didn't make it through
mostly
the
Caitlin.
meeting.
Caitlin's really good.
So excellent source of information.
We can help.
That's nice. So that is typically sometime early to maybe second week of June. It's a lot of fun. And it's a good opportunity. A lot of people get together and just.
Right, yeah, December, whoa.
So, so that is something to keep on the radar as we move forward. So, next item, matters not anticipated within 48 hours. And, I have none of those. Anybody else does, but if there are none, then I will accept the motion to adjourn. And a second.
Second.
Okay, and roll call vote. So Nancy,
Aye.
Tina,
Aye.
Andy,
Aye.
Kristen,
Hi.
Al, hi, Caitlin,
Hi.
Sarah,
Hi.
Kathy, hi, Joe,
Aye.
Jason,
Aye.
and Carol.
I